just before workers were reportedly threatened with being fired from their jobs if they fled during deadly tornadoes, corporate lobbyists blocked legislation designed to prohibit such job termination. According to the Daily Poster, Amazon has links to the corporate lobbying groups that have been opposing the legislation. In Illinois, where at least 6 workers were killed on the job, Amazon workers stayed in place despite warnings from the National Weather Service of possible tornadoes 36 hours ahead of their deaths.
Amazon has not explained why employees were not instructed to stay home, saying, quote, the company took an additional step by encrypting internal help ticket messages about the Illinois facility, making them inaccessible to most workers. Founder of the Daily Poster, David Sirota, joins us now to discuss the tragic apparent mismanagement and what, if any, consequences they will face. David, welcome to the show. So help us understand this a little bit. What was the legislation? Why would any, first of all, company want people to work when there's a natural disaster on its way? They know it's coming. They're like, I mean, what in the world happened here?
Well, look, it all goes back to at-will employment. At-will employment in America, in most states in the country, basically says an employer can fire you for essentially any reason that's not covered in our civil rights laws. So if your employer doesn't like the color of your tie, you can be fired. What happened in Illinois was Illinois lawmakers were trying to change that standard to a standard called just cause. The idea being that your employer has to have a just cause in order to fire you. A pretty simple idea. By the way, a wildly popular idea. That bill has been blocked in the Democratic-controlled Illinois legislature amid a flurry of lobbying from corporate interests and corporate lobbyists in Illinois. Some of those groups connected to Amazon being a member of some of those groups. So the point is that in the lead up to this disaster, you had corporate groups trying and successfully stopping legislation to essentially empower workers to walk off the job in a situation like we saw in Illinois without fear of being fired. And this is not just an Illinois issue, it's all over the country. Again, the standard all over the country, I think a lot of people don't know this, is that if you don't have union protections, if you don't have a specific contract that says otherwise in your job, your employer can essentially fire you for any reason at all, even if you don't show up for work or leave your work site in the middle of an impending natural disaster.
And how would this interact with the subcontracting that Amazon relies on so heavily? Because, for some people who are actual employees of Amazon, they are at-will employees and can be fired, but they're at least employees. Others are connected to these, subcontractors of subcontractors who are then, sent into the building, and so don't actually have anything other than a very attenuated relationship to Amazon. So how would the just cause kind of assert itself in that situation?
It's very, very similar, and it's a great question. Many of the lobbyists who fought this bill in Illinois were representing those subcontractors. There's a trade association that represents those subcontractors, and we should be clear: that subcontracting relationship exists in part to let Amazon not have basic obligations to workers. Hey, they're not really our workers; they're only supposedly temporary workers. It's really the problem of the staffing company. So it's a kind of a shell game to try to avoid responsibility. But again, it's the same standard. The idea is that an at-will employment relationship allows a staffing company or a big employer itself to simply get rid of workers for any reasons that are not covered in the civil rights laws. Just cause would say you have to have a real rationale to fire people. And again, in the era of climate change, where more and more of these disasters are happening, where more and more workers are going to be forced to make a decision, do I stay on the job or do I leave? Do I not show up because there's a potential flood or a potential hurricane, or do I have to go to work? That threat of being fired is real, and workers knowing that they don't have a legal standard of protection, that makes the situation worse.
And what was this bit about the encrypting of the safety information? Can you explain more why people couldn't access that? What was going on with that?
Well, it sure looks like Amazon is trying to not allow details of what happened before this disaster, to not allow those details to really get out. That essentially this looks from the outside, it looks like a PR control, an attempt to make sure that people aren't asking questions. But these questions need to be asked because let's be clear. This isn't the first time a natural disaster has hit an Amazon facility or a safety situation has happened at an Amazon facility that has really hurt workers. And to bring it back to this question of the employment relationship, let's remember it's not just a natural disaster situation. If workers see that their facilities are not safe, if they see, for instance, the structure itself of a warehouse doesn't seem to be holding up, they're under a situation where if they try to blow the whistle on that, they can be fired under our current at-will laws. So this is why just cause laws, when the polls go out and ask people, do you think your employer should have to have a rationale to fire you? This is why these laws are so popular, because I think the rank and file people understand this is not a fair relationship.
It also,
this is so.
Go ahead, Kim.
Go ahead, Ryan. Well, I'm just amazed by I think so many of us haven't thought about this, right? We know that there are some protections for certain groups of people when it comes to whether, when they're fired. But, really hasn't dawned on many of us, I think, that, oh, gee, in the event of a natural disaster, be it a tornado or an earthquake or maybe not an earthquake as much because those kind of suddenly happen, but certainly a tornado, it's coming, or a fire. We get these fires here in California, they're coming and you're potentially in danger and you need to evacuate. I think so many of us don't actually think that, oh my gosh, there is no protection for saying, I don't feel safe here. On the other hand, I can see from your last example how it could potentially be abused and why employers would say, I don't want this sort of protection for workers, because you might get somebody coming in and they would look around and they'd say, well, I just don't really feel safe with these boxes so high up in the factory, in the warehouse. And so you can't fire me for saying I don't like this. So I can kind of see where some companies maybe would push back on this. But at the same time, it seems like common sense that there should be at least protections for in the event of your life is in danger.
And let's be
Well,
clear,
you have like OSHA regulations,
policy.
right? There are regulations that say the workplace has to be, safe or broadly defined. I don't know enough about OSHA for like what it has to do with natural disaster preparedness. Maybe nothing. But that's the keep the workplace safe effort. So it's not.
Yeah, look, let me interject here on the natural disaster. There is a pretty straightforward way to deal with this. Miami-Dade County in Florida. They passed an ordinance saying that if the government essentially says that there is an emergency or orders an evacuation, a worker cannot be fired for following that order. So at minimum, it seems that should be the most basic standard, that if the emergency services say itself, this is a dangerous situation, you should not be here. Workers should not face the threat of being fired by their employer for complying with those orders.
Yeah, that seems like common sense.
Yeah, and Miami, not a famously worker-friendly area. So
Exactly.
if they can figure that out, because they've been dealing with this extreme weather for so long, we might as well make it nationwide, because you're right, it's going to be part of our new ecosystem going forward. David, great reporting. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.